Right now, as you watch this video, there are more than 16,000 active satellites flying over your head, and two countries alone control almost 90% of them. One nation has built a fleet so massive it now outnumbers every other country's satellites combined, 10 times over. The other nation started this decade with barely 600 satellites and has quietly tripled that number in under 2 years, with plans to launch 27,000 more before 2030. This is not just a story about technology. This is the new high ground of global power, and most people have no idea how dramatically the numbers have shifted in just the last 12 months. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who is winning the orbital race, why the picture is far more complicated than a simple head count, and what it means for the future of your night sky, your internet connection, and the balance of power on this planet. Stay with me, because the real story is not what you think. Let's start with where we actually stand today, in 2026. According to live tracking data pulled from official orbital catalogs, there are just over 16,200 active satellites currently circling Earth. If you include satellites that have died but are still drifting up there, along with rocket bodies and larger tracked debris, that number climbs past 18,000 objects. And if you tried to count every fragment of debris larger than a single centimeter, you would be looking at more than 1 million pieces of material orbiting our planet right now. This is a staggering shift from just a few years ago. The active satellite count has grown roughly 7-fold since 2019, and more satellites have been placed into orbit in the last 3 years than in the entire previous history of spaceflight combined. Let that sink in for a moment. Everything humanity launched from the beginning of the space age until the early 2020s has now been surpassed by what we have launched in the last 36 months alone. So how did we get here? To understand the current race between the United States and China, we have to go back to where this all began, because the story of satellites has always been a story about national power. It started on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, a simple metal sphere weighing about 184 pounds, broadcasting nothing more than a steady radio beep as it circled the planet. That beep sent shockwaves through Washington. It meant the Soviets could put an object into orbit, and if they could do that, they could theoretically put a warhead anywhere on Earth. The United States responded within months, and for the next 3 decades, the space race was defined almost entirely by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, trading milestones in a tense technological standoff. China was not even a serious factor in that story. Its first satellite, Dongfeng Hong-1, did not reach orbit until 1970, more than a decade after Sputnik, and for the next 30 years, China's space program grew slowly and mostly quietly, focused on strategic necessities rather than mass deployment. For most of the late 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the number of active satellites in orbit grew at a fairly modest, predictable pace. By the early 2010s, there were only about 1,000 active satellites total, shared among all the spacefaring nations on Earth. The United States, Russia, and a handful of European nations held the majority, while China's satellite fleet remained comparatively small, focused on reconnaissance, navigation, and early communications infrastructure. Nobody was talking about tens of thousands of satellites. Nobody imagined a single company launching more spacecraft in a month than most countries had launched in their entire history. Then everything changed, and it changed because of one company and one idea. In 2019, SpaceX began launching the first satellites for a new constellation called Starlink, designed to blanket the entire planet in high-speed internet from low Earth orbit. At the time, most experts in the space industry were skeptical, building a constellation of thousands of satellites, launching them in batches, and replacing them every few years as they naturally deorbit sounded financially reckless. But SpaceX had something nobody else had, a fully reusable rocket in the Falcon 9, which meant the cost of launching mass to orbit dropped dramatically compared to anything that came before it. That single advantage rewrote the entire economics of the satellite industry, and it triggered an arms race that is still accelerating today. Now let's talk about the actual numbers, because this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. As of the most recent tracking data in 2026, the United States operates the most active satellites of any nation on Earth, and it is not remotely close. The U.S. fleet sits at over 12,000 active satellites, which works out to roughly 75% of every functioning satellite currently in orbit around our planet. China, by comparison, sits in a distant second place, with just under 1,500 active satellites. That means the United States currently operates roughly 8 times as many active satellites as China. On the surface, this looks like a complete and overwhelming American victory in the orbital race. But if you stop the story there, you are missing almost everything that actually matters, because that headline number is dangerously misleading, and the real story is about direction, not just position. Here is the number that changes everything. Of that massive United States total, more than 10,800 satellites belong to a single constellation, SpaceX's Starlink. That is roughly 67% of every active satellite currently orbiting Earth, all operated by one private company. If you strip Starlink out of the equation entirely, the picture flips almost instantly. Without Starlink, the United States would operate somewhere around 600 active satellites. And that number, 600, is almost identical to what China currently operates outside of its own mega constellations. In other words, when you remove the influence of a single commercial company from the United States side of the ledger, the two nations are essentially neck and neck in terms of traditional government, military, and scientific satellite infrastructure. The American lead in raw numbers is real, but it is a lead built almost entirely on one company's business model, not on a government space program racing to outbuild its rival satellite for satellite. This matters enormously for how we interpret the competition, because Starlink is fundamentally a commercial internet service, not a strategic government asset in the traditional sense. Even though the Pentagon and other agencies do lease capacity from it for military communications, China's growth, on the other hand, tells a very different and in some ways more alarming story for anyone watching the long game. China's satellite fleet has roughly doubled in just the last 2 years, climbing from around 600 active satellites in 2024 to close to 1,500 today. And unlike the earlier decades of slow, incremental growth, this expansion is being driven by 2 enormous state-backed mega constellations that are still in their early stages of deployment. The first is called Guohang, a national network initiative backed directly by the Chinese government, which currently has around 168 satellites in orbit, but is planned to eventually include roughly 13,000 satellites. The second is Qianfan, which translates to Thousand Sails, a Shanghai-backed commercial and state-linked network that currently has around 126 satellites in orbit, with an eventual target of more than 14,000 satellites. Add those 2 planned totals together, and China has publicly committed to deploying roughly 27,000 satellites into low Earth orbit over the coming years. That is nearly double the size of America's entire current satellite fleet, Starlink included, and China has barely begun deploying either network. Some analysts estimate China would need to add somewhere in the range of 10,000 or more satellites just to match the current American total. But if both Guohang and Qianfan reach their planned scale by the early 2030s, the gap between the 2 nations could narrow dramatically, or in certain scenarios, essentially disappear. This is why simply counting today's satellites and declaring a winner completely misses the point. The United States holds a massive lead today, built on the extraordinary success of one company's reusable rocket technology and aggressive deployment schedule. China is playing a longer, state-directed game, laying the groundwork for constellations that could eventually rival or exceed Starlink in scale, backed by the full resources and long-term planning capacity of its central government. One side is winning the sprint. The other side is building for the marathon. And in the middle of all this, there is a third major player that often gets overlooked in this conversation. The United Kingdom currently ranks third in the world for active satellites, almost entirely because of OneWeb, a constellation that was originally British-funded and remains registered in the UK, even though it is now part of the France-based Eutelsat group. Russia, the original superpower of the space age, has fallen to a distant fourth place today, with somewhere around 180 active satellites, a fraction of what it once operated during the peak of the Cold War space competition. Now, satellite count alone does not tell the whole story of who holds the advantage in orbit, because not all satellites are created equal, and this is especially true when we shift from commercial internet constellations to military and strategic space assets, which is where the real geopolitical tension lies. When it comes to satellites specifically dedicated to military use, the picture looks quite different from the broad numbers we just discussed. The United States currently operates around 247 military and dual-use satellites, the largest dedicated military space fleet on the planet. These assets support intelligence gathering, precision-guided weapons systems, secure communications, and navigation infrastructure that underpins everything from commercial shipping to consumer GPS on your phone. China follows in second place with around 157 military satellites, a number that has grown steadily as Beijing has invested heavily in what analysts describe as the rapid militarization of its orbital presence, narrowing the historical gap with the United States year over year. Russia holds third place with roughly 110 military satellites, many of them modernized versions of systems that trace their origins back to the Soviet era. What makes this military dimension so important is a concept called dual-use technology, and it is quietly one of the most significant developments in the entire satellite conversation. Many modern satellites, especially the newer ones being launched by China, are not purely civilian or purely military. They serve both purposes simultaneously. A satellite might officially provide disaster monitoring or agricultural imaging for civilian use, while also being capable of providing high-resolution surveillance data to military planners. This blurring line between civilian and military space assets allows nations to expand their strategic capabilities while framing the investment publicly as scientific or commercial infrastructure. It also makes the true military balance of power in orbit far harder to calculate from the outside, because official military satellite counts likely understate the real strategic capacity that both nations, and increasingly other countries too, actually possess in low Earth orbit. This growing competition is also reshaping how both countries think about the vulnerabilities of space itself. As more of a nation's economy, communications, navigation, and military coordination depends on satellites, the incentive to develop anti-satellite weapons and other means of disrupting an adversary's orbital assets grows alongside it. Both the United States and China have tested anti-satellite capabilities in the past, and defense planners on both sides now openly discuss space as a potential domain of future conflict, not just a peaceful scientific frontier. Whoever controls the most resilient, redundant, and defensible satellite infrastructure holds a genuine strategic advantage in any future crisis, which is exactly why both nations are pouring so much investment into rapidly scaling their orbital presence right now, in this decade, rather than waiting. There is another massive player quietly reshaping this competition that deserves real attention, and that is Amazon's Project Kuiper. As of early 2026, Amazon has launched over 300 satellites toward its planned constellation of 3,236 spacecraft, racing against a Federal Communications Commission deadline that requires roughly half of that total to be deployed by the middle of this year. Kuiper represents a second major American mega constellation, entirely separate from Starlink, which means the United States is not just relying on a single company's dominance. It has multiple competing commercial ventures, simultaneously expanding America's orbital footprint, each one adding to the country's overall lead in raw satellite numbers, and each one creating additional redundancy and resilience for American space-based infrastructure. So what does all of this add up to when we zoom out and try to answer the question everyone actually wants answered? Who is really winning the orbital race between the United States and China? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you are measuring and over what time frame. If you are measuring today's raw satellite count, the United States wins decisively, operating roughly 8 times as many active satellites as China, driven overwhelmingly by SpaceX's Starlink constellation. If you are measuring traditional government-administered satellite infrastructure, stripping away Starlink's commercial internet fleet, the two nations are far closer to parity than most headlines suggest. If you are measuring military-dedicated satellites specifically, the United States still leads, but China has been closing that gap steadily and is investing aggressively in dual-use assets that make the true military balance harder to assess from outside intelligence circles. And if you are measuring future trajectory and planned deployment, China's public commitments to Guoyang and Tianfeng represent one of the most ambitious satellite expansion plans ever announced by any government, with a combined target of roughly 27,000 satellites that could fundamentally reshape the balance of power in orbit by the early 2030s. There is also a broader, planetary scale consequence to all of this that goes beyond the competition between any two nations, and it is something every astronomy fan watching this video should genuinely care about. The European Space Agency projects that if all of the currently planned mega constellations from every country are fully deployed, we could be looking at somewhere around 100,000 active satellites in Earth orbit by the year 2030. That is roughly 6 times the number we have today. This explosive growth is already creating serious challenges for ground-based astronomy, as bright satellite trails increasingly streak across long-exposure telescope images, complicating everything from asteroid detection surveys to deep sky observation programs. It is also dramatically increasing the risk of what scientists call Kessler syndrome, a theoretical scenario first proposed by NASA scientist Donald Kessler back in 1978, in which the density of objects in a particular orbital band becomes so high that a single collision triggers a cascading chain reaction of further collisions, generating debris faster than it can naturally decay, and potentially rendering entire orbital regions unusable for human activity for generations. With active satellite numbers having grown 7-fold in less than a decade, and every major spacefaring nation racing to add tens of thousands more, this is no longer a distant hypothetical. It is an active concern for space agencies, insurance companies, and international regulators who are struggling to keep pace with a rate of orbital congestion that nobody fully anticipated even 5 years ago. When you step back and look at the entire picture, what we are really witnessing is not simply a competition over who can launch the most metal into space. It is a competition over who controls the infrastructure that the next century of human civilization will be built on. Global internet access, military communications, precision navigation, climate monitoring, disaster response, and national security all increasingly run through the satellites orbiting above us right now. The United States currently holds the numerical lead, powered by an extraordinary private sector achievement in reusable rocketry that fundamentally changed the economics of spaceflight. China is playing a patient, state-directed long game, building the foundation for constellations that could reshape the balance of power within this decade. And caught in the middle of this race is the sky itself, growing more crowded, more contested, and more strategically vital with every single month that passes. So the next time you look up at the night sky and see a bright, steady light gliding silently overhead, remember that you are not just looking at a piece of technology. You are looking at a tiny piece of a much larger contest for control of the ultimate high ground, one that is unfolding faster and with higher stakes than almost anyone outside the space industry fully realizes. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we cover stories like this every single week, tracking the real numbers behind the headlines in astronomy and space science. Hit the like button if this changed the way you think about the space race. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.